Hello! Today I'm taking a look at the recent Final Fantasy news that was dropped at the Final Fantasy VII Anniversary event, and despite the quite brief announcements from Yoshinori Kitase, a fair amount of hype has emerged, owing to the titles and the trailers that were teased throughout that session. And jumping right in, what we are seeing in a nutshell is a broad multi-device and multi-platform expansion of the Final Fantasy VII compilation, something like a second wave, or Phase 2, following the concurrent releases of Advent Children, Crisis Core, and all of those games back in the mid-2000s. And this time around, what Square are doing is, rather than simply expanding the narrative in all directions with sequels and prequels and creating these quite disparate stories that orbited the nucleus of Final Fantasy VII proper, the original game, what we're seeing now is that they are simultaneously revisiting and retelling that original Final Fantasy VII story, while bringing the broader tangent and perhaps outdated elements of the other compilation material into the current generation, in hopefully quite a cohesive and consistent way. And a prime example of that, which we've already seen released, is the Final Fantasy VII Remake DLC, Intergrade and Intermission, which sees Nero and Weiss from Dirge of Cerberus feature as bosses, showing this ambition to sort of unify and canonize a lot of these different threads of story. So, beyond mere DLC content to flesh out these narratives, the additional standalone titles that we saw in the anniversary trailer included the updated Final Fantasy VII First Soldier, so a new season of that, which is a free-to-play battle royale game, a remastered Crisis Core, which was met with considerable celebration in the stream that I was watching, followed by some of those eternal arguments of remakes versus remasters. We saw Part 2 of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is dubbed Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, being teased. And finally, we saw Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis, which is a comprehensive bundling and adaptation of pretty much the entirety of Final Fantasy VII, covering the timeline from First Soldier all the way through to Dirge of Cerberus. But within that, it also teases new elements, such as the early years of Sephiroth and stuff like that. So I'll kick off first with Ever Crisis, actually, because of all of the games that were announced, weirdly, this one stood out to me as both a hit and a miss for Square in several key ways. Firstly, on the one hand, this is almost the Final Fantasy VII Remake that a lot of fans originally had in mind, insofar as it's a pretty faithful repackaging and retelling of the original Final Fantasy VII, along with the additional compilation stuff that we've already discussed. And it feels like, to run in tandem with the actual Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is a new story, Square are actually trying to provide an update of the original for those that want it too, and doing so in such a comprehensive format, with all of the prequel-sequel content bundled in principle, this feels like a win. Additionally, the look and feel of the graphics, which retain a throwback faithfulness to the super deformed field style of Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy IX, I really quite liked the look of, and while there was some criticism being thrown about in the livestream, I felt that they balanced the nostalgia factor with a current gen fluidity and lushness of graphics. And they even retained and updated the figurative realism and transition into the battle screens, in juxtaposition to that kind of goofy, super deformed style. So I loved that, and the footage of the limit breaks and the summons, they looked really cool in the Ever Crisis clips. Now, if this sounds too good to be true, then for many fans it probably is, because the flip side of Ever Crisis, and what may prove a detractor for some, is that rather than a console or a PC release, it's a free-to-play mobile game. And undoubtedly there is a market for this somewhere. Mobile gaming is big in Japan, for example. But for many, and me included, it's not a platform or a business model that I'm particularly fond of when it comes to gaming, and particularly immersive, story-driven gaming of Final Fantasy's sort of calibre. So, to qualify that, beyond the reductive controls and mechanics that are inherent to mobile games, the development models for free-to-play games usually adhere to either in-game advertising or in-game purchases for revenue generation. And while both of these are quite obtrusive, I think Square opted for the worse of the two, with loot box purchases being the source of weapon and equipment upgrades in Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis, because depending on how it's implemented, and of course I haven't played it yet, so I won't judge until I've tried it, but I think this can potentially impact gameplay and progression badly, essentially forcing purchases to advance through the story. And more so than that, and as someone who works in experience design, and I work in digital product design, I've long questioned the ethics around in-game purchases, and particularly things like loot boxes, because for a percentage of audiences, the developers tap into this repetitive and compulsive behaviours that some people have, and they are specifically designed to do this. And I think it's just a very poor way to commodify a game experience. So to see that applied to a game that I really quite love, I do have mixed feelings about that initially, for what might otherwise have been the perfect like-for-like remake for the majority of legacy fans. So, moving on, I won't labour too much on First Soldier or Crisis Core, but with regards to the latter, I am really glad that the remaster is confirmed. I very foolishly sold my PSP and my special edition Crisis Core back in about 2010, and it's a decision that does haunt me. So to see Zack and Angeal and Genesis return with a bit of a makeover, I think it's great to see. As it's a remaster, it's unlikely there'll be too much in the way of additions or improvements or changes. But as Square are making an effort to update and unify the compilation stories, it's entirely possible that there will be some extra bits included. And the fact it's called Crisis Core Reunion may tease to the idea that it's slightly different and changed from the original PSP game, which obviously prefixes Final Fantasy VII proper, perhaps most prominently with the ending, which, if it were to tie together with the remake timeline and this new story, we may see an alternative outcome for Zack in Crisis Core Reunion. So that'll be interesting to see, but moving finally now onto the Final Fantasy Rebirth trailer. It was brief, but very intriguing, and there was a lot of stuff condensed down and teased into those 90 seconds that immediately provoked speculation as to what's going on narratively. But first off, I just want to take a moment to appreciate the music, and this applies broadly to the remake so far, and I did mention it in my review of the 7 remake. But once again, in this trailer, I noted just how brilliant the soundtrack is, and whether it's the remixes or the original scores, I think they are really doing well at crafting atmosphere through the audio here and the compositions. And this particular piece in the trailer just really seemed to sort of nail it. But beyond that, what the trailer has done is double down on the alternative timeline and really play up to that. So Aerith's monologue, for example, about changing the future, echoes out over flashes of meteor hitting Gaia, and there's a caption that reads, "What is fact, what is fiction?" And that pretty much sums it up. This change has now happened. There is a divergence in the original timeline. And alongside that, we have dialogue between Cloud and Tifa, where he says that he thought she died, and she questions whether he thinks she's some kind of imposter. So we can see here the writers are really upending and juxtaposing the original story, where, as we know, following Cloud's flashback story in the village of Calm, it's actually Tifa who starts questioning whether he's an imposter, in the original game. So they're really kind of playing around with that, and it's interesting to see how this story is changing. Beyond that, a few other points that people have pulled out. We have the symbolism of the white feather, which floats down over the opening, which is a visual of Zack and Cloud. Another weird appropriation of Final Fantasy VIII, if you ask me. But the main speculation around this is what or who the white feather symbolises, because, of course, Sephiroth is the one-winged angel, embodied by the black feather, and the white feather has variously been attributed to Tifa, Cloud, Angeal, Genesis, or Aerith. And for me, I always felt that the main juxtaposition to Sephiroth was Aerith, and I've explained this in my Aerith character episode and my Sephiroth character episode, which is how they are complete opposites. One is a saviour, the other one is a destroyer. One is harmonised with nature, the other is an unnatural abomination, and one wields the white materia, and the other the black materia, and so on. And I feel like that Aerith is very much a conduit between past and present and these changing timelines. So to have the white feather float over Zack and Cloud kind of makes sense, but I'm also conscious that that's the premise of the original story, and the character arcs and the story beats are very much changing. So I'm not sure to what degree this duality between Aerith and Sephiroth will be retained, because the remake has clearly reframed the story to focus more on Sephiroth and Cloud, and trying to enforce that duality perhaps between Sephiroth and his pursuit of Cloud in this past/future environment. But moving on, definitely the most intriguing thing for me, narratively in this trailer, and obviously towards the end of the first part of the remake, is Cloud's increasing awareness of Zack's existence. And perhaps of all of the elements of this renewed timeline, I think Sephiroth's awareness of the past/future events and his overall intent with that, and Cloud's renewed clarity around Zack and the events of 5 years ago, are the biggest intrigues, along with secondary elements such as what does this mean for Zack's eventual survival or not, and indeed what does this mean for Aerith's eventual survival or not, and the relationship between these two with one another as well. So that's definitely an intrigue, and because of this shift in characterization and character arcs, it's very hard for me now to think of Final Fantasy VII in terms of the original title and the original story beats that occurred there, such as the Village of Calm, then the Mithril Mines, and then Junon, and so on. And this brings me on to one of the most alluring and telltale gameplay scenes, which is Cloud and Sephiroth seeming to be walking across this stretch between Nibelheim and Mount Nibel. Now, if like me, you've previously thought about the remake in terms of the original game's story beats, it's easy to assume that the scene of Cloud and Sephiroth is the flashback, which is when Cloud's telling his story at the Village of Calm. And indeed, to that end, it's probably a very conscious decision on Square's part to throw that particular scene into the teaser. However, what we saw at the end of the remake part 1 was the moment of divergence from the original timeline, wherein Sephiroth is even goading us to defy destiny with him. And we are literally destroying the fates, the whispers at the end of the game. So to assume that it's so straightforward as to be Cloud's flashback, I'm quite dubious about that, or particularly Cloud's flashback in the sort of passive telltale way that it was in the original game. And it's just as likely to be the consciousness of present Cloud and present Sephiroth journeying back together through these memories, or it could even be contemporary events of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which sounds beyond the realms of possibility or likelihood, but we need to consider that this Final Fantasy VII is going to be 3 games, the first of which was set entirely in Midgar. So the reality is that some locations and story elements may get mixed up and cut and abbreviated and retold along the lines of this new story, unless of course the game is biblically huge. And so, owing to the timeline being messed with, the existent chronology of leaving Midgar, visiting Chocobo Bill, visiting Calm, and so on, as I've said, it may be completely upended too, and I guess we'll have to wait and see. And just for the context of scale, comparably speaking, if we think about the end of Disc 1 in the original Final Fantasy VII, that doesn't end until the City of the Ancients and the death of Aerith, by which time we've already done most of the southern hemisphere of the world map. The Gold Saucer, Rocket Town, Cosmo Canyon, all of that. And Disc 2 doesn't end until we've done the northern part of the map, so the crater, the snowy village, and then back down to Junon, Midil, and going through Cloud's traumatized mind and all of that stuff with Tifa. So I don't think we'll be quite tracing these familiar steps through the course of Rebirth and beyond. And I think visitations to both old and new locations will be facilitated through new story, possibly new characters, because we can't discount the notion that Zack will have playable segments too. And indeed, having a dual playable story where Cloud and Zack are seeking one another out, or at least Zack is seeking Aerith, for example, it might help cover locations a bit quicker. And funnily enough, after completing the part 1 of the remake, and I saw Zack return, I could just picture Square replacing the recurring NPC dialogue of, "Oh, a man with a black cape just passed through here," with comments like, "Oh, a guy dressed exactly like you just passed through here," now that Cloud and Zack have assumed this doppelganger coexistence. So it's interesting to see, and I admit I was dubious about where this story was going when I played through the remake, mostly through how they handled Sephiroth from the outset, and the whispers and all of that stuff. But I'm actually getting quite into it now. It is fun to see where it will lead, and I think the prevailing intrigue is that no good story gives without taking, and we've got Zack, Cloud, Aerith and Tifa as significant counterparts all on the same chessboard now. And part 1 concluded with the party merrily walking down the road. So it does feel unsustainable, for want of a better word. And indeed, beyond that, thinking about the macro narrative, most stories that explore alternative timelines and tangent universes have a moment of divergence in the introduction, which we've seen, and then a moment of convergence by the ending. So how the dust settles in this telling of Final Fantasy VII, who's left when the world resolves into a linear timeline, that will be very interesting to see. And personally, it's hard not to think of that ending in Spider-Man No Way Home, where all the tangent universe heroes are fighting together before disappearing back to their own world. But with Final Fantasy VII being a little less wistful and Marvel, I think we'll certainly have some dead or incapacitated characters along the way before then. So there we have it. First impressions and reactions to the Final Fantasy VII Anniversary event. A bit of speculation as to what might come next in Cloud Strife's saga. And if you got this far, thanks very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And feel free to drop a comment below. Let me know your thoughts and reactions to the event and the future of Final Fantasy VII.